This video is on a tool that's really useful in textual analysis, and it's not that well known in language analysis because it's an idea from narratology, which is an area of literature studies, but it's super useful for language, and especially later on I'll get into how it's good for AQA paper 2 question 3, where you get text about a language issue. It can be really good for that. But let's explain the idea first. So this is a chain of what's involved in somebody reading something, and you can see at one end you've got the actual author, at one end you've got the actual reader. But then between that there are other ideas that are useful to understand. So I'll do a video on implied reader, but this one's going to be about implied author. The implied author is the author that the text creates, so the author that seems to have written a text when you read that text. And because writing is planned and asynchronous, so somebody can write something and then somebody could not read that for a week or 100 years, and normally it's distant, so you normally wouldn't be sat right next to the person who's written something when you're reading it. That means that there is a separation between the actual author and the implied author in any text, and sometimes the difference is enormous and sometimes the difference is basically nothing. But the implied author is the author that the text creates, and that lets us analyse the text without needing to have loads of specific contextual information about the actual biography and situation of the actual author. And it's very useful in textual analysis because every text has an implied author, and therefore you can always use it on any text that you're analysing. The rest of the chain, because I might as well explain it, you've got narrator, which I assume most people know, so if there's a character telling the story, that would be the narrator. Narratee is if there's somebody having the story told to them, but within the world of the story, that's the narratee. So Heart of Darkness is a story where some mariners are on a boat and they're being told a story at the start of it, and so they're the narratees, but not all texts have a narratee. It's a kind of counterpart for the narrator that some texts will have. And then I'm going to do a video on implied reader. Actual reader is just the person who's actually reading it. I'm going to go through some example text to demonstrate how the concept could be useful and what kind of things you can pick out. And then as the last one, I'll get into an exam type text, and you can see how this would be useful for AQA paper 2. If you're not doing AQA as your exam board, then I don't know as much about your spec. I would imagine it's probably still useful for that, but I teach AQA, so that's why I'm focused on that. These are tweets by the footballer Joey Barton. Came through at Man City. He had quite a tough upbringing, and he's clearly had quite a temper, and since then he's had anger management and things like that. But when he was coming through as a youth player, I think he got in trouble for stubbing a cigar out on a youth player's eye at a Christmas party. But this is him losing his temper with a former teammate, Dietmar Hamann. From the bottom up is the order in which these were published. But you can see he's extremely cross. I'll explain why I picked this text in a minute. There's some sample analysis so you can see what I think there's to say about it. If you want to read that, you can pause it and read it. I'm just going to read the topic sentence. So these tweets create an aggressive, wronged, implied author who's been goaded into an argument by someone not worthy of his attention. Notice that there's a difference between your judgment of him as a person and what you truly think about him and his behaviour, and then the implied author, because I think he's clearly a man who's lost his temper here and is trying to insult Dietmar Hamann as much as possible, including like making lots of personal remarks and picking on a slight twitch that he has, which is all quite ungenerous behaviour and unpleasant behaviour. But in his mind and in the way that he represents himself, he's been wronged and he's been goaded into an argument by someone who's beneath him. So disappointed in myself suggests that he normally has high standards. You can see the analysis is what I think there is to say about this. And the reason I like this text is because after this happened, he then posted a long apology on his website. You can see on the right, on Monday evening, tweets exchanged between Dietmar Hamann and I went beyond the boundaries of banter, opinion and common sense. And who among us can say we have never gone beyond the boundaries of banter, opinion and common sense? You can see that this is wildly different in style to the tweets, which I think is very enjoyable for how absolutely contrary the style is. So one of the things that implied author can be really good for is allowing you to get into register. Formal or informal register is quite often used to create a sort of impressive or sober or educated or high status implied author. Or similarly, sometimes you get an informal register used to create a sort of accessible, friendly implied author who's on the same level as the reader. It lends itself naturally to getting into features. So this one I think is great because it's so formal and it's so radically different from the tweets that you can see that the kind of the person who has written these, the implied author of these two pieces, is radically different, even though nominally it's the same actual human being. And obviously probably the implied author of this was actually a paid lawyer or PR person. They're both sort of nominally Joey Barton, so I think you can talk about the implied authors interestingly. So in the apology, a formal register is used to create a sober, serious, respectful implied author who understands what he did wrong. And then I did a bit of labelling to show you the kind of thing you can do, and there's a kind of natural comparison there. And then this is a tweet from 2012. Twitter used to be really good and really funny a lot of the time. Some of the people from it ended up working in the American entertainment industry as comedy writers. But so this is a tweet by Anthony Nedroid. Anyone reading this at this bar and wants to do some kissing, AOL me. So the comedy of this completely comes from the implied author. It's ridiculous, the idea of someone at a bar who wants to be kissed or wants to kiss someone, and the proposal is instead going on social media and posting something that they should AOL them. AOL being an obsolete messenger service that even by 2012 nobody was using. So the purpose of this is comedy, and it does that by creating a ridiculous implied author. You can see I put some analysis on the screen there. Then a bit later, he posted this subsequent tweet, so I want to be somewhere quiet and with dogs. And so I think this kind of develops the implied author, where he's someone who's socially incompetent and extremely nervous and anxious and can't talk to people. And he's still apparently in this bar, or at least somewhere social, that is upsetting him. And the slightly weird phrasing of quiet and with dogs, I think, is good because it feels very self-conscious and awkward. Together, these tweets create a socially incompetent implied author who's visited a bar with romantic aspirations but was anxious about talking to anyone, and who then found it too stressful and wanted to leave. And then this is an example of the kind of text you could get for AQA paper 2. Question 3 and 4, you get texts on a language topic, and they're often prescriptivists, so people that are trying to tell people how to use language, often very traditional, often quite stuffy. And they have a problem with implied author when they're writing about things, because what they want to do is tell people how they should be using language and tell them that the way they're using language is wrong, and complain about the stuff that they think is uneducated or stupid or lazy. But on some level, even these writers are aware that that's quite dislikable. It's not a very friendly, egalitarian way to engage with people, to just tell them that their language is wrong. So quite often at the start of articles written by prescriptivists, they'll do this sort of dance where they try to create an implied author who is a reasonable person, or well liked, or someone who has standards, or someone who deeply cares about the reader and is just trying to save them from the problems that they'll get if they don't use English properly. This is Simon Heffer doing that. If you don't know who Simon Heffer is, this is him. He's written for the Mail, he's written for the Telegraph. He wrote a book called Strictly English, which is worth looking up if you want to see kind of maximum prescriptivism. He used to, apparently when he worked at the Telegraph, he would send round emails to the other staff telling them what they'd done wrong in their articles and the mistakes they'd made linguistically. But he hasn't read any modern grammars at all, so he's just working off what he learned at his private school, and he doesn't seem very interested in modern grammars. Like, he wouldn't know what a determiner was, or wouldn't ever talk about a determiner, because he'd just talk about articles. So he's not really expert, but he fancies himself extremely expert. And there's articles he's written where he said things like the word decimate has been wrongly used for more than 100 years, because he thinks that it should be used in only the ways that the Romans used to use it, meaning exactly reduce in strength by a tenth. So he believes all sorts of kind of strange stuff that doesn't really make any linguistic sense. But I think this is a good example of where his implied author is a potential problem for him, because he's about to tell people what they should do. So, can English though ever be fixed? Of course not. If you read a passage from Chaucer, you will see that the meaning of words and the framework of grammar has shifted over the centuries, and both will continue to evolve. But we've had a standard dictionary now ever since the OED was completed in 1928, and learned men, many of whom contributed to the OED, wrote grammars a century ago that settled a pattern of language that was logical and free from the danger of ambiguity. And then further on, he says, English grammar shouldn't be a matter for debate. It has a coherent and logical structure, and we should stick to it. For if we do stick to it, the result can only be clarity, and therefore happiness. I think this text is interesting because he's going out of his way to create a more sympathetic implied author. That whole bit at the start where he says, can English though ever be fixed? Of course not. I think that's him creating an implied author who is reasonable, who is open to argument, who's not just some doctrinal character who's obsessed with specific rules and wouldn't allow any sort of change. By fixed here, he means pinned down rather than mended. But so that's him going out of his way to try and create an implied author who isn't a sort of stickler, who's insisting on ancient rules. And then at the end, I think you get this implied author who is telling people things only because he cares about their clarity and happiness. And the idea that clarity equals happiness is odd anyway, but you can see that implied author is something that prescriptivist writers often go out of their way to manage more sympathetically than might otherwise be the case. So here's a bit of analysis sort of written up. I think implied author is super useful. Sometimes it basically will be the person who's written the text, but often it isn't. And as soon as you unhook implied author from actual author, it frees you up to go and analyse all sorts of interesting details in the text.